Amotz, let me get your view on that, that Israel should be held accountable, that the occupation, as Laila says, should end.
Well, come on. Laila just said that no amount of persuasion will make Israel, for instance, stop the settlements. But actually, Israel did stop the settlements. For instance, during the premiership of Ehud Olmert last decade, when he placed on the counter in negotiations with Mahmoud Abbas all the goods, the territories, and he was just waiting for Mahmoud Abbas to sign on a map. And he wouldn't do that. And then even the hardline Benjamin Netanyahu later also agreed to freeze for a set period of time settlement activity. In other words, there were such Israeli gestures in the past, and there were such Israeli attempts to come to terms with the Palestinians. This is even before we discuss the even more outgoing and overarching ways of Shimon Peres when he was prime minister. It didn't work out, and our conclusion here in Israel in the face of all that was that the Palestinian interlocutors we face are at best willing to engage in deals that would be intermediaries and middle steps towards a future complete dismantlement of the Jewish state. It's a grim conclusion, but it's a very practical one, and one that is also very hard-earned.
Amotz, let me ask you this, because part of what the Egyptian foreign minister was talking about was a settlement based on the 67 borders. That, of course, would mean that there would be no Israeli presence in any of what is called the occupied territories right now. Is that something that Israel would be prepared to do, or is it a non-starter?
First of all, his wording is based on and not completely equal to. There is a big difference between the two, and the very principle of using the 67 borders as only a basis for a remapping has been accepted by the Palestinian leadership. I mean, of course, the Palestinian leadership that is in the West Bank, and not the Palestinian leadership that is in Gaza, which disagrees with the Palestinian leadership in the West Bank and is not willing to even recognize Israel's existence. But if we discuss Abu Mazen and the Palestinian Authority, who are based in the West Bank, they agreed with the principle of using the 67 lines only as a basis for future adjustments in the border. Hence, the phrasing to which the Egyptian foreign minister very wisely and pragmatically resorted to.
Right, and I should just remind our viewers that Abu Mazen is also the name of President Mahmoud Abbas. Hamoud, I'll get to you in a moment. I just want to get to Hamoud. I mean, there are deep divisions here, as we've just heard, on the question of settlements and the question of the status of Jerusalem, and we haven't even talked about the status of returning refugees. Let's look at the Palestinian side. They remain divided. There's a moderate leadership in the West Bank. There's Hamas in Gaza. Is this an obstacle? How much of an obstacle is it to reaching a comprehensive peace settlement?
It is a huge obstacle, and this is what everybody tells the Palestinians. The Palestinians themselves understood that Palestinian unity is very, very important, that the Palestinian leadership should be on one page, that they should not be having internal fighting, such a division that we have at this point hinder the movement forward of the peace process. But we also should understand that they should not be used to deny the Palestinians their rights, and not to look into serious ways of moving the peace process forward. What's happening in a lot of areas is that the facts have changed on the ground. The dynamics, the movers, the leaders that move the peace process in the past, or that moved the peace process in the past, have changed. The demographics in Israel have changed. The movement of about 1 million Russians coming after the collapse of the Soviet Union to Israel and establishing an Israeli identity changed the power. The Israeli leadership no longer talk about the normalization that Ishaq Rabin used to talk about, that Shimon Peres used to talk about, because of the realization that the Israeli mode today is that if we are secure enough, if we build walls, if we build our security system, we are going to be safe.
Laila, go ahead.
Well, one, nobody really cares what Mahmoud Abbas thinks or does anymore. He's completely morally and politically bankrupt and has no legitimacy amongst the Palestinians. And it's really the opinion of most Palestinians that the Palestinian Authority should be dismantled and Oslo should be disavowed. Two, every peace process has been a smokescreen for Israel to continue its territorial expansion, in line with its governing policies since its foundation, which has been territorial inclusion, demographic exclusion, right? More land, less Arabs. And so there's no denying that. And there's always been a so-called partner for peace, but it's just the same sort of phrases that are recycled by the Israelis to be able to forestall, postpone as much as possible any kind of negotiated settlement. There was never a mention of Palestinian statehood anyways in the Oslo Accords, we all know that. And lastly, we talk about settlement freezes and so forth. Again, a fiction. I mean, it's all, how many more freezes do we need? I mean, it's been going on for 20 years. Settlement, expansion was at an all-time high under the Netanyahu administration in the 1990s, in the heyday of Oslo, right? And even in the past few years, we had thousands of new settlers brought, by way of settlement expansion in Jerusalem, for example. So, I mean, again, all of this talk is completely absurd, completely bogus. We know that settlement expansion is ongoing. And again, the only way to do this, to be able to stop this, is to be able to put pressure to hold Israel accountable. And if we're talking about specifically, then, for example, withhold U.S. aid, which is by every measure, politically, economically, so forth, works against U.S. interests in any case.
Amos, talking about Israel and its search for a partner, as it says, to negotiate with, Israel has made it clear that it will not negotiate with any Palestinian delegation that includes members of Hamas. That sounds like a precondition. How does one overcome that? And I ask you that because I presume Israel would want to reach an agreement that is comprehensive, that includes everybody.
I will address that in a second, but first I have to make one correction to what Laila said. She said there was no denying that Israel has always wanted maximum land and minimum Arabs. That is unfounded factually, because Israel, in having gone to Oslo and in having later the Israeli voter, having later elected Israeli leaders who said for the record that they want to cede the West Bank in turn for peace. The Israeli voter, let alone the Israeli government, said plainly they want less land in turn for peace. So let's get that one accurate. Concerning Israel's attitude towards Hamas, it is not that it is disqualifying Hamas inherently and indefinitely. It simply says that negotiating with an entity that does not recognize Israel's right to exist is futile to begin with. What will we negotiate with them? The terms of our hanging?
All right. Let me go to Hamoud. If we look at the current composition of the Israeli government right now, it's dominated by hardline right-wingers. We have Avigdor Lieberman. He replaced Moshe Yaalon as defense minister. Lieberman is a defense minister who's once said that he wants to expel Palestinians from Israel to the occupied territories. He wants to behead Arabs who show disloyalty to Israel. What chance of a peace settlement with men like him in the Israeli government?
It's a very, very serious question, and that speaks volume to where we are at this point. And it's also its reflection of what's going on in the whole region. There is a sense that the Palestinian issue, the Palestinian rights, that the Israeli-Palestinian issue is no longer an issue that we should be concerned about, and that gives ammunition to the leaders to state what they do. That certainly doesn't bode well for any attempt to move the peace process forward. But again, there are some dynamics in the Israeli society that we need to consider when we talk about peace. We're gone from the old generation where the idea of having a two-state solution, despite however you want to define that, and I know it's very, very complicated, but the old generation believed that normalization meant the Israelis recognizing the Arabs and the Arabs recognizing the Israelis, and the two together could live in peace and security. This is what some leaders, Palestinian leaders, talk about, a one-state solution. That generation is gone these days because of the dynamics that changed in the Israeli population.
Okay, Laila, the French foreign minister said that the two-state solution is in, quote, serious danger. Do you believe that it's still possible to have two states?
I mean, absolutely. It's pretty much conventional wisdom by now, and I think the Israelis recognize this based on statements that a multitude of Israeli leaders have made over the past few years, references to if we don't do something quick, and whatever that something is, again, is questionable, but if we don't do something quick, we're going to be faced with an apartheid-like struggle. I believe this was Shimon Peres who said this. It may have been Barak. but that we're going to be faced with an apartheid-like struggle for equal rights in a one democratic state. This is from, Israeli leaders saying this. The Palestinian leaders recognize this, and clearly Palestinian civil society, with their call 10 years ago, this month for a global movement of boycott, divestment, and sanctions, recognizes this. This is the only way. Be it now, be it later, you can come up with all the different peace initiatives you want. You can talk about how, settlement freezes, and you can talk about how peace-loving Israel is, but the reality, sooner or later will emerge. You can only parcel off so much more land. You can uproot so many more trees. You can deny Palestinians so much more of their freedoms and rights. But ultimately, you're going to be faced with a situation where Palestinians, what they're going to be demanding is, again, their rights and freedoms, not bypass roads and different license plates and IDs that only allow you to go to certain locations. And, I do just want to follow up with one thing. It's not about land, right, for peace. In reference to what he was saying, it's about which land. 42% of the West Bank right now, taking into account military, infrastructure, settlements, and so forth, security, so-called security zones, has effectively been annexed by Israel. So again, not which land, disengagement from Gaza, but a retention of effective control over all of Gaza's markers of sovereignty. We haven't even addressed Gaza and how it's completely been parceled off
let me get
and isolated from the West Bank.
Let me get Amotz's response to that. 42% of occupied territory is occupied by, of Palestinian territory is occupied by Israel. It's used by Israel.
First of all, to answer your broader question, I absolutely do think that the two-state solution is feasible. I think that while it would be quite a logistical endeavor to relocate hundreds of thousands of people, it is doable. It has been done in other times in history. And parenthetically, I should say here in this context that what Minister Lieberman said was not, at least openly, he never said that he wants to expel Arabs. He said that he wanted population exchanges by agreement of the sort that took place historically, for instance, between Greeks and Turks after World War I, or between Indians and Pakistanis after World War II. Having said all this, I say that a two-state solution is feasible, but the prerequisite is not about some kind of a physical remapping, nor about some contractual crossing of T's and dotting of I's, but about a mental transformation whereby, first of all, the Palestinian education system will cease to speak to its own children in a language of hate and libel, in a language of denialism, and in a language that dehumanizes us Israelis and, more broadly, all the Jews. This is the prerequisite. When Israelis and Jews look at all this and listen to all this rhetoric, what comes to their minds is the Jews' historic experience with the medieval church, and that's a non-starter for any peace deal.
Okay, I have some final questions for the two of you. That's Laila and Amotz, and I need some short answers because we're running out of time. Laila, Israel's Foreign Ministry Director General Dori Gold blames the breakdown in the peace process on Palestinian violence, and you would say?
The onus is never on the occupied, and the onus should never be on the oppressed, but somehow that seems to be the common narrative, the fiction that Israeli leaders produce. It's your fault, we're culpable in our own estranglement, in our own enslavement. And it's, again, absolutely absurd, but this is, nothing new to be expected. And I should say quickly, as a Palestinian mother, I take great offense at this notion of Palestinians teach their children to hate, and somehow that is the problem. If any child learns to resent something like a military occupation and an assault, what teaches them that is not their mothers. What teaches them that is 100-ton bombs dropped on their villages and their towns. It's tanks in their neighborhoods. It's the fact that their own parents and grandparents are denied the right to return to their land. My own husband, he grew up in a refugee camp. He's unable to even visit the land of his ancestors, the land of his parents and his grandparents and so forth. He can't even return to Gaza because Israelis continue to deny us the right of family unification. That hasn't even been addressed. They continue to control the Palestinian population registry, for example.
Amotz, let me get your response to that.
Well, first of all, herein lies the problem. Laila decries the results of violence, but she conveniently ignores the fact that those who introduced violence into the conflict were the Palestinians, well before Israel's establishment and well before anyone was displaced anywhere. This is the crux of the problem, the very failure to look into the facts and to the historical chronology and to assume responsibility for mistakes. For instance, is Laila prepared to say to us now, to your viewers, that the Palestinians made a mistake in 1948 when they rejected the United Nations partition resolution? That is one of the original sins of the entire conflict. Had they not made that mistake back then, which was a mistake politically and a sin morally, had they not done that, they would not have been where they are today, or rather they would not have been absent from where they're absent today. Is she prepared to concede this?
Okay, I'm afraid this is going to be a conversation that we will continue at some other time. We've run out of time here. Thanks to all of you for joining us.